In this video you're learning how to sew buttonholes. Now I have sewn near 150 buttonholes on jackets and samples. I don't know where my other swatch has gone annoyingly though, with about like 48 on it or something. But I have fresh learner tips and proficient practitioner tips now as well. As well as that, in this video there are a few other things silk thread can be used for. It seems fitting to link Andrew Ramroop's video on sewing on buttons, even though he now also has a video on sewing buttonholes. But yeah, I'm not going to include my own guide on how to sew on buttons because I don't feel I have anything to add and you'd just be losing Dr. Ramroop's soothing voice. Plus, he mentions how to make a makeshift gimp that you can use for your first few tries. As I was coming up to 100 buttonholes, when I got to about 60 on my first one of these swatches, I decided that I would spend about an hour and a half every day just sewing 3 buttonholes to give myself this skill. So, I don't know, I just thought that's maybe a usable practicing technique that you could borrow. Personally, I wax my thread anytime that I am going to do any kind of hand sewing, with be that with machine thread or silk thread, except when I'm basting. It strengthens the thread and inhibits it from coiling and tangling. A lot of tailors, I am aware that they don't wax at all except for sewing buttonholes. There is Gutermann pre-waxed silk and silk skein, which is basically the same thing but synthetic silk, I think. They are basically lengths of pre-waxed thread where we just have to iron them, and they are about 1 1/5 meters as well. In my somewhat limited experience with waxed thread, it does have a use-by date, but about weeks though, so not soon. I'll usually take 3 to 5 lengths of silk, cotton or polyester, but usually silk or polyester. I don't use cotton thread. And most often about 1 1/5 meters. It's a convenient length to use, that way you don't need to get more thread immediately. So take your one piece or your multiple pieces and your wax and draw the thread over it tightly. Do that about 3 times, maybe once. I really don't know. I kind of like the rule of 3 though. It works for me. With a hot iron and a piece of scrap cotton, fold the thread between the fabric and draw it under the iron. Not too quickly. Do that 3 times as well. Sometimes once works, but it's a good rule, I guess. When thread is properly waxed, I would describe it as feeling brittle, which I think is the wax having solidified again in the fibres. If you waxed several lengths at once, to separate them, hold onto one end firmly and pick a single thread on the other end. Grasp it even more firmly, and you should be able to easily pull that one thread out. We can also press our gimp. It might be bent and coily if it's just come off a roll or been posted. We can press it just raw this time. We can pull it under our iron until it's mostly straight. For your first few buttonholes, I don't necessarily suggest that you need to don't necessarily say that you need to invest in silk, gimp or a hole punch. You can, but I didn't, so I'd say it's definitely possible to skip that too. I think what is most important is proper and or correct technique. With regard to silk though, which is often referred to as buttonhole twist, I use an Italian one, which I'm told generally means it's finer, which I get from Mac & Wallace. If you're practicing, they do small discounts for boxes of 10, which is neat. So it's $2.15 for a reel, for one 10-meter reel, or $12.60 for 10 of those. I've found that for a 20mm buttonhole I need about 1.2 meters of thread, not doubled up. However, with the much thinner machine thread, I would suggest doubling that up for your first buttonholes. With regard to what you're sewing your buttonholes into, ideally you want a piece of body canvas sandwiched between two pieces of cloth. Otherwise, I'd suggest 3 layers of cloth. Really, you want a tightly woven wool cloth, but I've been kind of using calico, which frays quite easily, so I guess that's been a bit of a trial by fire. To make things most simple for myself, I made a large sheet to practice on. 18 centimeters by about 45, because that's how much canvas I had on hand. 2 pieces of fabric and a piece of body canvas. I basted them together around the perimeter. We could pinking shear the perimeter to make it a bit more aesthetic, and since it's calico, it is more prone to fray. I want to put columns of 20mm buttonholes onto it. Firstly, I measure from the top of the sheet down about 3 centimeters from the shorter edge. Between each row, I'm measuring about 3 centimeters, but I'm only doing the top 3 for now. I'm measuring the columns now. Firstly, starting a few centimeters from the long edge. I want 20mm buttonholes, so I measure 20mm from the first vertical line. Then a 25mm gap between each buttonhole to give us space to work. Then more 20mm holes, then 25 gap, then another row of 20mm buttonholes. I'm just circling the lines here that we're sewing buttonholes into, just to clarify. To prepare the hole for penetration, we know where it is, and we need to secure the 3 layers together. Baste around the hole with a slip stitch. We machine around the hole, which heavily inhibits fraying. We use a much smaller stitch length for this. Start at the end where the turn is going to be, where we create the keyhole portion where the button is going to sit. Without backtacking, machine down one side of the hole to be. Turn 90 degrees at the start and end of the hole and make about 3 to 5 stitches so that it's about equivalent of 2 or 3 millimeters across before turning up again back to the turn locale. At the top is where you then make the turn with a hole punch. Mine is with a diameter of 3 millimeters. Center it on the stitching rather than the hole if the two aren't perfectly aligned. Unless you have very broad scissors, you'll be able to snip down the center of the stitching from the hole, all the way to the bottom, though try not to cut the stitching, and stay equidistant from both longer lines of stitching. To sew the buttonhole, we can start from the reverse and tie a knot in your chosen thread. Begin stitching about 1 centimeter from the stitching and make 1 or 2 pricks to the center of the bottom of the stitching. We'll cut the knot away later. Move the needle and thread through the hole to the front. Send the needle underneath the front, right at the edge of the cut of the hole, and come up around 3 millimeters beyond the cut. However, this is the width of the buttonhole, so it can vary. Keep the needle in the fabric. Place the gimp between the hole and the needle. Hold it there at the base of the hole. Use the tailing thread from the needle, so that's the doubled thread, then pull the needle all the way through, and pull the thread taut at a shallow angle, so close to the fabric. It won't quite be tight yet, you need to do another couple of stitches before the thread is holding itself in place. So keep it under tension as you do the next few, which is the first of two things that really require the most practice here. It's making all the subsequent stitches the same length and keeping a consistent width between each one. In Maurice Sidwell's relatively recent video, he breaks down the points very well. So the best I can offer is practice, and practice a lot, with proper technique. You want each stitch to be touching the last, but there's a fine line between that and 2 columns up, and all of the knots vying for space. It looks unsightly. To keep the stitches around the same width, we could try to look at the weave. If it's a fairly loose one, keep trying to hook the needle behind the same piece of the weave. As you're stitching up the side, keep pulling the thread not quite into the hole, but maybe pulling the thread taut at around a 45-degree angle. I'm still early doors, which is why I take longer to sew a buttonhole. It isn't so second nature for me to stick it into the right place first time. So you'll often see the needle sticks through the fabric, then retreats back. Just bide time and reposition before you commit to a stitch. In the same vein, on the underside of the cloth, when we stick the needle through the cloth on the underside, what I do is put the tip of the needle through the hole and touching it to the cloth, far beyond where I want to put the needle through. Keeping the tip touching the cloth, dragging the needle towards the hole to the position where I want to make the stitch from. This way, any loose bits of the weave are pulled into the buttonhole stitch and trapped. Like I said, you can see me every time I make a stitch, I drag the needle back and then push it through the cloth. If it's not quite in the right place, drawing it back out and trying again. We keep our hand holding the cloth in the same basic position throughout. Each stitch is the same. We keep our hands the same to reliably do the same movement for each result each time. We move the cloth between each stitch. If I were better at framing, which I'm not, I keep moving off center. To be fair, you do not know the ridiculous setup I had that day. Anyway, if I were better at framing, you could speed through the video at 20 times speed and you'd see the cloth just zipping around my fingers, while my left hand holding the cloth almost doesn't move at all. You know, usually I say that we mustn't pull the hand stitches too tight, otherwise they will draw together, causing tightness and rumpling in our work. Something very undesirable. You know how I said usually we don't want to pull the stitches tight? Me neither, I'm paraphrasing from memory. Regardless, this is the exception. After each stitch, when we've pulled the thread through, we need to give the thread a tug, still towards the direction that we're pulling the thread, to lock the knot in place. As I sew a 20mm hole, I wonder what the disadvantage to only sewing a 15mm hole like that which you'd find on surgeon cuffs. I literally cannot think of a single reason not to. If anything, it'd be more economical, and given the turn is the more difficult part of sewing the hole. I suppose it is building a greater level of patience, but you do you, and make sure that you do a dress rehearsal of the 20mm hole before the main event. Like I mentioned, in Dr. Ramroot's video he mentions how to make a makeshift gimp, and I said that you can use doubled up thread for your first buttonholes. If you don't have a hole punch, having prepared your hole, you can simply cut the buttonhole straight and then cut your keyhole with your scissors. Don't stress that it will look bad. Honestly, I have reservations quality-wise about my first 90-ish holes, 42 of which were on the last one of these sheets that I did, and the rest were a motley selection that I did on different doubled up fabrics, mostly without gimp or anything. I hadn't gotten any actual silk, gimp, or a hole punch until at least my 30th. I did, however, put buttonholes on several of my shirt cuffs so that I could put cufflinks on them rather than getting more shirts. Shirt buttonholes translate well, just no gimp as far as I'm aware, and I just used regular doubled up thread. When you feel ready, Kenton Trimming sells gimp by the meter. It's good because a roll is normally more than £50. You'll only need a few meters for a whole 100 buttonholes. I needed 2 for my last 50 or so. As we approach the turn, begin to pull the thread taut, almost right up, keeping the knot out of the hole. As you go around the hole, you need to leave space between each stitch, otherwise it will be far too dense. As you go around, move the gimp to stay on the edge of the fabric. In a lot of ways, it'll be somewhat trial and error before you can eyeball or feel the correct number of stitches around the circle. You could count the number of stitches you do for a hole and decide whether you need more or less, and spread that number evenly. For example, I might do 15 stitches with my hole punch diameter and gauge of thread and gimp, 1 at each of the 90-degree points, 2 each between the straight edges of the buttonhole and the horizontal 90-degree points, and 4 each between the vertical point and the horizontal points. From this I could and have chalked guidelines for my 15 with a sharp piece of chalk equidistant around the circle. It's more practice though to make the hole symmetrical. Getting back to the other straight edge, it's just the same down to the bottom as it was going up. Something that you can do, like the guy from the Yorkshire Tailor video said, you can count the stitches up and down. I won't and can't make you do that. An important question that needs to be answered, I think, is why TF do we hand sew buttonholes? It is not stronger or empirically better than a machined buttonhole. On a true bespoke jacket, there is significant hand sewing involved. Most is very subtle, if not downright hidden. If anything, that's a sign you've done well. But buttonholes are front and center, literally. Having this hand embroidery so openly presented on your jacket simply elevates it. Untrained eyes can still tell the difference in machine and when it's hand embroidered. When time is taken to do the buttonholes, the care is obviously also taken to sew everything else. It can be a letdown when something so prominent as the buttonholes are machined after you've spent hours already felling, prick stitching and hand sewing so much else. I'm practically repeating the same reason in different ways, but there are only very few reasons. It's a case of deciding whether these reasons are worth the time investment, not just for the buttonholes themselves, but learning to make the buttonholes, deciding whether the time saved machining the holes is worth it when there is already so much time and effort put into this collection of cloth. There are good buttonhole machines out there. I haven't met any of them, but specifically ones that cut the holes first. Definitely not ones that cut the hole after stitching it. So you could say it boils down to so much hand sewing is invisible that it can be nice to properly show off some handcraft techniques in our work. Something that you can see I'm doing in places is trying to trap some of the fraying portions of the hole. This is just so that I can avoid cutting away too much of the cloth and canvas, which would lighten the buttonhole and make it a bit weaker. I try to sew around it, trapping it with my buttonhole stitches. Some of it I've already sewn past the length, so there's no real way to trap it without bits of the frayed cloth sticking out between the stitches. All that said, you can try pre-binding the buttonhole with big thread or silk thread or whatever, timestamped in the description. Upon getting to the bottom, the last stitch you make should be parallel to the first stitch you made, keeping the needle and thread safe as we trim the gimp. Pull on it, ideally with something like pliers, so that we can draw out an excess of the gimp to properly hide it away, which will also tighten the stitches and warp the hole. Trim the gimp where it sticks out from under the stitches. To return the buttonhole to the proper shape, put something circular and small into the turn and pull the hole straight again, like the tip of a pen or small embroidery scissors. The thread will be in the center of the buttonhole, so take the thread and send it underneath the fabric next to where your first stitch came out, i.e. on the opposite side that you finished, so that the last stitch is being pulled towards the hole. Then come back up next to where the last stitch came out. Do that a couple of 3 times, which creates a bar tack. Then either coil the thread around the stitches or do the buttonhole stitches around it, which by the way I illustrate in a minute with the bar tacks. They're both just window dressing, so it doesn't really matter what you do. Some tailors prefer coiling it because it's less bulky. This is just a case of personal preference. Either way, I personally feel that you should try and catch a small amount of the buttonhole stitches adjacent to the bar tack so that it's held in place. I go into detail with the bar tacks, but as you're coiling, looping the needle underneath the bar, pull the thread tight away from where you started, while using a finger from your other hand to gently pull the coil upwards towards the start. This way you shouldn't get too many coils, which keeps it small and clean. Upon getting to the other side, go to the underside of the buttonhole. Do something similar to the bar there, coiling it on this side too. Prick stitching through the fabric and the canvas, only 2 or 3 pricks. Pull on the thread and cut it right where it comes out of the fabric. The tail will be hidden. Do the same for the knot. Flip to the front again. I can push the knots together. We want the end, you'll be able to push the line of knots into one another, improving how symmetrical it looks. Similar can be done at the turn at the keyhole. Push the knots inwards and you should be able to get a consistent line of knots touching. However, I suggest that you don't push them into the turn, otherwise they might be too dense and push against one another. Usually, if there's more to be done on the jacket that you've just sewn a buttonhole into, you need to secure the whole back together with basting thread or your leftover silk. The good doctor ends his buttonholes in, I think, a much nicer way than I have done. Check minute 8:38 for how he finishes his buttonholes. A Milanese buttonhole is its own style of buttonhole, usually only used as the lapel hole, where the gimp is basically wrapped in a buttonhole silk and sits on top of the buttonhole stitch. The buttonhole is prepared in the same way without hole punching it, and maybe we could use this opportunity to machine fully around the circumference. Snip into the hole, since there's no hole punched, and cut up to both sides. We'll start almost identically to the normal buttonhole, tying a knot and securing the thread and prick stitching up to the hole. At the center of the bottom of the hole, send the needle through the hole to the front and we'll do the normal buttonhole stitch to secure the gimp. Now to deviate, we'll do a buttonhole stitch but without catching the gimp. Move the gimp out of the way, loop the doubled up thread from the eye of the needle over the needle and pull the stitch through. To wrap the thread around the gimp, hold the gimp down and send the needle underneath in the direction that we're stitching. Pull the thread snug under the gimp and make the next buttonhole stitch. Move the gimp out of the way again, and the coil will be held in place. Each time we loop the gimp, the thread needs to be touching the previous loop, completely covering the gimp. The first two stitches are the most difficult because the gimp isn't being held down until after both of them. After you've done the first, normal stitch, you have to make sure that it's tight, otherwise the gimp will fall out. After the next buttonhole stitch that doesn't catch the gimp, however, the first stitch will be locked in place. Therefore, like I said, you need to make sure that the first stitch is tightly holding the gimp down and you are keeping the thread taut because it's not supporting itself at the moment. I'm sure that how we hold and handle the gimp can vary depending on how we feel comfortable. It might help to hear how I like to do it though. As I'm stitching, when I do the buttonhole stitch without the gimp, I keep my thumb near where I am making that stitch, using my thumb to have pushed the gimp up and out of the way, looping the double thread from the eye of the needle over the needle and pulling the stitch through to lock the previous coil around the gimp. Then I use my thumb to trap the gimp so that the loose end is towards me and creates a loop, sending the needle under the loop and pulling the thread around it. At the turn, it's quite easy to do all the buttonhole stitches that we need to do so that the gimp is sufficiently covered. It'll become a semicircle of buttonhole stitches at the apex of the hole, while the gimp is just bent around laying on top of the boutonniere. To finish, we'll get down to the start of the hole, except we did a normal buttonhole stitch to hold the gimp in place. We need to do the same thing parallel to the first. Cut the excess of gimp away from our first and last stitches. Bar tack across them as well. Something different we can do instead of prick stitching away from the hole, we can force the needle back towards the buttonholes and bury the trailing thread underneath the buttonhole stitches. The use of wrapping gimp in silk creates a more shiny effect. My first Milanese buttonhole was pretty good. This might be my 6th, so you might not necessarily need to practice it a lot if you can do normal ones already, but of course definitely do a dress rehearsal. Something you might have noticed, even though I skipped past it, is that the machine stitching I did to prepare my Milanese buttonhole came off of the cloth. This is because I sewed it too close to where I cut. Something we can do to inhibit this happening, and to prevent the cloth from fraying in general, is to use either basting thread or our silk after we cut the hole to bind around the edges. I am hiding the tail of the thread and coming out of the hole near the bottom. I fasten the thread by just stitching around the raw edge a couple of times, moving up the raw edge about halfway, doing a stitch there, then to the top, fastening at the top so that we can move to the other side, and down again. You might like to bind the hole anyway, because you can see that I'm trapping the bits of the weave of the cloth and canvas, preventing them from sticking out, preventing us from having to cut them away as they become a problem like I did earlier. Usually we mark on where you want the flower loop, usually an inch below the lapel hole on the reverse of the lapel and about as wide. Knot your thread and begin, similar to the buttonholes, just a few prick stitches approaching the start point. It really doesn't matter which side you want to start on. Moor the thread at the start point, make a few stitches, but don't pull the last one tight. Reach through the loop and pull the thread through it. Not all the way, but pull on the thread, which will collapse the first loop, and you're left with a second loop. Continue to pull the thread through, creating and collapsing new loops until you have it as long as you want it. When the chain of loops reach the other side of the proverbial hole, pull the needle and the tail of the thread all the way through the last loop and pull it taut. Fasten the thread where you want it and a few pricks away, cutting away the knot and the tail of the thread. At no point with the loop do you want it to be showing on the front side. And basically, all the flower loop does, it prevents the tail of your flower from coming out from behind your lapel. Gotta say, it's so annoying that actual 60 FPS looks so much better. You'd use a bar tack at places that are under a fair amount of stress, like the top and bottom of slanted pockets and the bottom of the J-stitch on trousers, etc. To begin the bar tack, you need to sew a bar tack. Secure the thread somewhere convenient but out of the way. Make a number of stitches, like 3 or 4, between the two places that need reinforcing. Basically, that is what holds the things in place. That's the bar tack. Everything else is just window dressing. Though we shouldn't be discounting the importance of aesthetics. For the first method, coil the thread around the bar. Be sure that the coil is unbroken, so all we see is the vertical thread rather than any of the horizontal bar thread. I feel that we should know that we don't necessarily catch the fabric. We want to use the blunt end of the needle and push it underneath the bar. Pull the thread down the bar away from where we started, however using our other hand to gently push the thread upwards. We need to pull the thread quite tightly so that it properly coils around the thread and wraps the bar, taking away the vertical bars that we made. We don't want to make the bar too bulky, so we pull the coils tightly towards the bottom of the bar so that the least amount of coils can cover the most of the bar as possible. You can see that I only make about 4, making sure that the last one I make properly coils all the way to the very end of the stitches. Sending the needle to the reverse, pulling the thread taut again before fastening the thread. For the second method, from the bar again we can essentially do a buttonhole stitch. I want to move from right to left, so put the needle halfway under the bar and hold it there. Loop the tail of the needle over it, clockwise, and pull the needle through, taut towards where we started, and then to the previous stitches. Do that all the way across. Unlike coiling, each stitch needs to be touching the last, and can't and shouldn't really be spaced out across the bar. Like I alluded earlier, this one is more bulky. Again, go to the underside of the bar and either coil the thread around it or leave it, fastening the thread. Something worth knowing as well is that sometimes a stress point has been tacked by machine, but then we want to cover that. I have machined a tack that I just did to represent that. Having fastened the thread on one side, we can simply take a small amount of the cloth either side of the machine tack, creating the bars again. We practically want to create the most shallow X as possible. Maybe as though we're doing a reversed prig stitch. This type of bar tack won't support any stress. It's not supposed to, since the machined tack does that already. I think I do too many bars. I think we need 3 at most, maybe even 2, just because it's purely aesthetic. Then wrap and fasten and finish the thread as before.